Damage to the Kerch bridge, whether Ukraine is implicated or not, is a huge humiliation to Russia. It's also a blow to Putin personally, and he has responded with vindictive attacks on civilian targets across Ukraine, as well as civilian infrastructure of the electric power grid. As Russia starts to lose the conventional war, will it turn to more attacks on civilian infrastructure using terror weapons? Today, I am speaking to Dr. Alina Nychyk about Ukrainian resilience, governance, and politics, as well as Russian terror tactics and potential endgames for the war. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Dr. Alina Nychyk is a political science scholar dealing with EU-Ukraine-Russia relations and the war in Ukraine. She gained her doctorate at the University of Manchester. Now she is a Ukraine Fellow at the Research Centre for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna. She has also been a social activist for many years and has been elected as board member of the Professional Governance of Ukraine. So Alina, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I believe you're currently working on a book where you compare the events of 2014 to 2022. What are the main differences, do you think, between Ukraine's response to the hybrid war that began in 2014 and, of course, the full-scale invasion of 2022? And what things have stayed the same?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting, and I would like to share a bit of a personal story. When actually this invasion started, I was finishing my PhD, and I had like a few weeks to finish. And apart from this being emotionally super hard, I also in the beginning I thought my research is not relevant at all because everything changed so much in 8 years. And so I had a bit of depression as a scholar as well. But then I started thinking, analyzing the events, and it appeared that a lot of things stayed the same, and the same misperceptions in EU-Ukraine-Russia relations, just say the same issues. Really now I see a lot of similarities. And during summer, I was already traveling across Europe and presenting my research in a way to showing which lessons from 2014 are relevant for the current Russian invasion. And so first of all, I would say that it's unchanged preferences. So preferences, big strategic goals, and for EU, Ukraine, and Russia, they basically stayed the same. So if we look at Russia, Russia have always had preference to control Ukraine, to have certain political, economic control over Ukraine, because without Ukraine, it cannot be a superpower. And Russia wanted to unite with Ukraine in different integration organizations to build the so-called new Soviet Union. And looking at Putin, Putin's personal preference is to stay in power as long as possible. So it's his individual preference. And as he's the main and not the only decision maker in Russia, so it's also relevant for policymakers to look at his personal preference. And since he was not and is not able to deliver any successes at home, so functioning economy, democracy, decent level of life, he's playing on Russia's foreign policy. So he's trying to deliver these successes, victories abroad. And so this Russia's preferences were missed also in 2014 by EU and Ukrainian policymakers and in 2022. There was no understanding to what extent this was relevant for Russia. Then looking at European Union. European Union's main preference was always to have stability near its borders and also economic cooperation with its neighbors, both Ukraine and Russia. So all this talks about European values, and that comes only second. So for relations with the EU, it was important to understand these preferences as well. So this preference stayed the same, and we see currently how hard for EU to implement sanctions, because still the core idea for EU is a good working economy, decent level of life. Secondly, the same as in 2014 and in 2022, EU and Ukraine did not believe in Russia's threats. In my research, I call it trust. You can call it predictability. So they had this information about possibility of Russia's attack. They had good intelligence from US, but both EU and Ukrainian decision makers could not believe. They had this trust that Russia would not break this agreement. And since at least last autumn, this US intelligence was opened, but no one believed. And Ukraine did not get prepared. And EU, yes, as well, they could not, they still had this trust and good intentions of Russia. But of course, the scale of the war in 2022 is so much different. So I could not see how Ukrainian leaders could choose, for example, a response that they did in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea, when they did nothing, because it was not possible for any leaders, anyone who would be in office. It wasn't possible just to do nothing as it was done during the Crimea. And also, if you look at Ukrainian army, it's in far better conditions. So it had this experience of 8 years of war. People got proper training also in Ukraine and with getting experience. And also, we should remember that during these years, Ukrainian army was also trained by NATO and in particular US. So there were a lot of professional people already. Ukrainian army was getting more and more professional every year. And in this year, it looks very much differently comparing to 2014.
And tens of thousands. I mean, this may not be that well known in the West, but tens of thousands of people would have had experience on the front line, you know, whether it's a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and they were rotated quite frequently. But a lot of people actually went and had experience on the front line, didn't they, in that sort of low-level conflict around the Donbass and the borders, as you say, over 8 years. That means a lot of people would have exposed and got that sort of, that direct military experience of how to sort of work as a unit and work under stress and so on.
Yes, there were a lot of volunteers also during all years, and in 2014 there were voluntarily units who self-organized themselves, and then they were joined to the army. And during current Russian invasions, there were a lot of also volunteers coming and joining army. And also to mention difference that Ukraine had some weapon already. So before invasion in February, even the West started sending some weapon to Ukraine. So it's total difference between 2014, when there was no Western weapon and Ukrainian army was totally destroyed, and all these Soviet tanks which never worked, and I think also that currently, as I mentioned, this full-scale Russian invasion, and it was not possible to react differently. I think it was, to some extent, both for Ukrainians and even for Ukrainian politicians, it was like a natural instinct. Like when you're attacked, like you need to protect yourself. Whether you are prepared or not, whether you're thinking, analyzing or not, you're just preparing. So I think it was natural.
And that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because it doesn't happen everywhere. We saw in Afghanistan, faced with a similar sort of collapse, as it were, or similar threat. In that case, the leaders literally ran, didn't they? I mean, they all exited Kabul, they all left when they could, and the regime collapsed extremely quickly. Are you surprised that, everyone really remained in place, remained to fight? And are you surprised at the sort of resilience that was shown in standing up to Russia when the war began?
I would like to tell there is already some different kind of research of this on this phenomena of Ukrainian society, how it inclines towards democracy, even hardest time, how it's able to self-organize and unite, because it looks really unique. I mean, yes, there was full-scale war, and maybe others would react the same, but still, it looks amazing. And also, there was war for 8 years, and we saw how volunteers defended Donbass in 2014. But still, some things you cannot predict. and some things you just cannot believe. For example, I think you know the story that one old Ukrainian lady shot down a drone with a jar of cucumbers, or like older men just going towards tents and just stopping tents with their bare hands. Or in these cities, occupied cities of Kherson and other in the south, people are going out to protest. People are going out to protest with flags, and the Russians are shooting at them. These are civilians, women with children. They're just going out and they're showing their support for Ukraine. So these things, I think, you cannot predict how people will react, and it was really unbelievable. Some of those, although you expect that yes, people would protect their country, but in such ways.
But also taking that risk. I mean, I think it's a really good point, isn't it? Many of the people that you're talking about, and there was a particular story back in, I think, March, where a very elderly man who had even some disabilities, but he had previous military experience, he went and somehow managed to persuade someone to give him some kind of rockets, and he went out to the street and destroyed a Chechen convoy almost single-handedly. And I mean, those stories are obviously fascinating, but it also says something, isn't it, that people are willing to risk their lives for a culture they have, their set of values, language. They're willing to risk everything without actually being certain that they will win at all. And that's in stark contrast, isn't it, to what we're seeing happening in Russia, where people also have, I would say, certain values or freedoms under threat. But the reaction there is to flee, is to run. And we've seen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people leave the country since February in 2 great waves. And rather than staying to defend their values, they flee in the other direction, even though in both circumstances, the outcome can't be sure. Anyone going to fight for Ukraine can't be sure of victory or even surviving, but nonetheless, they take those risks on and fight.
Yes, I would say Ukrainians have this kind of romantic that they're ready to fight for their land, because Ukraine was fighting for their country for centuries. Like there were always powers wanted to occupy Ukraine, and Ukrainians may also fight with each other when there are no external issues. But then when there is external attacks, then Ukrainians are able to self-organize and to fight. And comparing to Russia, I would say there is also yes, this mentality of fighting but not escaping. It's a difference between Ukraine and Russia, but also Russians attack Ukraine. So it's like if you escape, then you leave your house, you leave everything, and you will lose this. It's your country. So I would say that some kind of this patriotic feeling would appear in any country, and to extent to which, yes, we can argue. But I think, but when you're threatened and you're able, I think it's just like emotion, like instinct to protect yourself. But some people had a chance to leave. Some people, like actors or scientists, they had a chance to leave, but they just wanted to protect their country.
And that, coming back to something you mentioned earlier, so of course, the leadership were taken a little by surprise. I don't know to what extent they were doing planning behind the scenes just in case, or whether they could have been better prepared. But it wasn't only the Ukrainian leadership that were surprised at the full-scale war. It seems to have taken a lot of people in Russia by surprise. I think many commentators who I watch, who are normally fairly accurate, very cynical, very critical of the government, almost all of them were saying right up until the invasion, no, this is a bluff, it's irrational, it won't happen. And I think even many in the military were frozen out of that decision-making process. So it's even though British and American intelligence were saying that this definitely looks like it's going to happen, there were many, many commentators on all sides saying, he won't go that far. And this is out of character or out of instinct with his previous behavior, which has been much more cautious, perhaps, or risk averse in his previous aggressive moves.
Yeah, and then that's the same as it was in 2014. I wanted to read you one part of my interview, which I got when doing research on 2014-15, and I spoke with European Union's ambassador to Russia, who was in Russia between 2013 and 17, and referring to Russian aggression again, first time against Crimea, he told me there was some intelligence reporting, and even there were some researchers who have alerted about possible military actions. But the common sense among European Union's leaders was, no, that's impossible. No, Kremlin will not go that far, because agreements with the West have been important. It comes that this common sense was not really common sense. When I read this, I feel it's still the same for 8 years. It's still this common sense, and still how European Union and the West judges Russia in terms of international law and these economic agreements. And then you have Putin and a few of his allies who make decisions by themselves, and we cannot understand this logic. Yes.
No, this is. I think that's very true. I mean, I saw Mikhail Khodorkovsky speaking about sort of 4 or 5 years ago, and at one point during the question and answers, he was asked, "Well, what should the West's approach be to Putin?" And he simply says, "Putin is a terrorist. He's like a mafia warlord. He's not a Western politician in the sense that you can normalize or rationalize using Western political models." He said the only solution is to close all of their embassies, have no trade agreements, have no dependencies, and cut all economic ties. And of course, the majority of the room, and these are all fairly well-informed people who are interested in foreign policy, you could hear the entire room gasping in disbelief and shaking their heads like, "Oh, he's gone too far now. That can't be true." And I think up until the war, even now, actually, you still have some in the West who try to normalize the situation, rationalize it, and are still talking about off-ramps, are still talking about negotiations, are still talking about trying to rationalize and normalize the situation to revert it back to some kind of normality. But that's to misunderstand who Putin is, isn't it?
It's again thinking within this our framework of international law, and thinking that Putin is a leader of Russia, democratically elected leader, and so we need to continue this discussion with the leader of this biggest country, and so it's hard for leaders in the West just to switch, to put themselves on in Putin's shoes. They don't try to understand him. They're just acting within their world, but Putin lives in another world.
And this is not confined to the West. I think many Russians will themselves try to normalize the situation, and perhaps don't yet realize how little their leadership actually care for their own lives. I think there's a sense of trying to normalize things as a human being. It's almost like a reflex, isn't it? You don't want to think that your country is evil, or you don't want to think your country is doing evil things in the world. And even when you have perhaps a consciousness that it is, you try to bury that deeply. I mean, I have via my wife, I have relatives in Russia, and it's impossible to have any kind of rational conversation because, whether it's through propaganda or whether it's through some kind of repressed guilt, they're not going to admit what's really going on, even to themselves.
I would like also to mention that when you listen to Putin, I think you have listened to him as well.
Yes.
But when you listen to his speech, it sounds quite convincing. Even, I mean, if I know the history and I know all the details, it sounds very logical and convincing. And when you listen to it deeper, you understand, okay, he misplayed this history here, and here he's lying a bit, and here, and then you can put this, you see small pieces, yes? But when you just listen to it, and when you don't have this information at all, you believe it. It's quite convincing, it's well prepared, he's a good speaker, and so there is also this mistake in the West and now in Ukraine. So it's underestimation of enemy.
Yes.
So just say that Putin is bad, yes, but he's a good speaker. Yes, he's dangerous. Yeah, you need to understand him, not just to totally reject him.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, in Russian, he is very articulate, very compelling, and unless you know the background to what he's talking about, and then you realize how manipulative actually a lot of that is. Well, if we take this idea that it's very difficult to predict what Putin does, but not because he's irrational or mad, but because he has a different frame of reference, a different decision-making process, which is very difficult for us to understand. That makes it actually difficult to predict what he's going to do next, isn't it? Because the war in 2014 started with hybrid tactics and was really led by those for quite a long time. Even when the full invasion of the Donbass started, there was an element of hybrid warfare there, pretending that these were independent movements, that they were organic movements where Russia sympathized, not that Russia had actually instigated and planned and managed the whole thing, which I happen to believe they did. There's still this element of hybrid war. Now we've entered full-scale conventional war, but it's not working, is it? Russia is not winning that. So once again, they're turning to maybe not hybrid tactics, but unconventional tactics. That is terror against civilians, energy warfare, food warfare, weaponizing refugees. They don't seem to have anything that they won't consider if it helps them towards victory. And they're not going to be able to win victory on the battlefield. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this and what they might do next.
Yes, it's very open now, but everything was almost as open is in 2014. So everyone knew that Russia annexed Crimea. Yes, it just everyone had this intelligence. Everyone knew what is happening in Donbass, and everyone in the West knew that Russia entered Ukraine with its troops for the first time in August 2014. So everybody had this intelligence, and but Putin was still saying we are not there. Although there were some interviews where he did mention that we supported this, we helped the referendum to conduct, we helped people in Donbass. So you could still catch it. So in one instance he was confirming, in others he was saying "Нас тут нет," we are not here, we are not there. Yeah? So he was still kind of playing. And again, for the West, it was hard, like at UN discussions. Yes, when Russian representative was saying, "No, we are not there." Ukrainian one was showing all the confirmations, and US all intelligence, and they were saying, "No, we are not there," and that's it.
And then propaganda. I think it's important to mention that propaganda work could still be used quite effectively. And I know many in the Western media have either intentionally or accidentally repeated these. But even when they admitted that they were there, they could say, "Oh, but we're there because, Azov regiment, we're there because Russian speakers are being discriminated, or we're there because these actually are Russians and not Ukrainians. They sympathize with us," and etc. So even though these things are not true, they're categorically untrue and actually easy to prove false. Nonetheless, the propaganda proves to be quite effective, doesn't it? Or can be quite effective still.
Yes, I still want to mention a bit to the previous questions that you mentioned, that Putin's ready to do everything. And I just wanted to tell that it may be shocking for the West, but there is nothing extraordinary in Russia's tactics. Russia is like this. It's again misunderstanding. So the ones who study Russia, they would say it's normal for Russia to threaten civilians, to use all kind of weapon. And Russia already showed its tactics in Syria. It also used attacks on Ukrainian and all kinds of weapons against civilians. So as you also mentioned, Russia is able to use any aims to reach its goals. So it's just it's what Russia is. It's we should just accept it and then think what we can do with this, and not just be shocked and concerned as the West. We're always concerned. Yes,
exactly. And we should perhaps anticipate what they could do by trying to get into their mindset. If we realize that they'll do anything if it advances their strategy, and that they have no moral barriers whatsoever, and that they place no value on the lives of their own soldiers. I think that's the first thing we need to accept. Then we can start thinking creatively about what they might do and coming up with a proper response to that. Whereas what you've said is always being behind the curve, always being reactive and shocked by their actions. We need to get ahead of that and be a bit more predictive and prepared on how to deal with those.
Yes, but you know, as we already discussed, there is international law, and you have these rules, and you cooperate with countries. And when you know that Russia can do anything, you just don't have a point of reference. It can be anything, you know. So it's of course hard, but Western countries, in particular US, they have enough intelligence, so they just need to use all information and just accept this different logic of Putin.
And to refer to the point I asked there, I mean, they are certainly losing on the battlefield, aren't they? And they're not going to be able to win this war conventionally. I think it's fairly clear now, isn't it, that the next few months, and whether it takes 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, or a year, they're gradually going to be driven out of Ukrainian territory in the conventional war.
Yes, it looks like this. Also, yeah, everything might change, and this attacks on civilians is of course showing weakness, because they cannot provide any victories on the battlefield, and that's a pressure on Ukraine, of course, to incline Ukrainian leaders for negotiations, because. I mean, yeah, when I read news and I read about new attacks, the only thing which I want as a person, the first instinct is I want my relatives and friends to live, you know, and so this pressures, and you just start wanting peace or anything. Yeah, you just want, like the first thought, you just want to stop this. You want to stop because it's crazy, you know, and so this. Such terror on the population, and now there is no water, there is no light. It's just crazy, and the winter is coming. So it's new tactics, and I would also like to point out, which I also found in my research regarding 2014-15, that Putin is not a strategist; he's a tactician. So he's able. Well, he has this preference to control Ukraine. He wants to stay in power, but regarding the whole strategy on in which way, how to do it, so he's always good at using this opportunity. So it was the same with Crimea. So there was no power in Kiev after Euromaidan. There was the situation, you know, and he used this opportunity very quickly. And he's able to use this quickly because he's the only decision maker, so he can make a decision and do it in a few days. And so now he's changing his tactic. We see during the war that there was this occupation of northern regions, then they withdraw, and they switched into south, into Donbass, and they withdrawing from Donbass, from Kharkiv, and then now it's south. But also there are discussions there. In Russian media, it's already preparations that they're going to leave this Kherson and the southern regions, and so they're just looking at the situation and trying to make their best from it. And so this tactics of threatening civilians, it's also new, and it's because of losses on the battlefield.
And that's similar, actually. You know, we've always assumed mistakenly that somehow Putin is playing chess. He's a master strategist and many moves ahead. But actually, I think what you've said there describes much better how he has tested the West over the years. And that is to, you know, assume that there's a vacuum, assume that there's weakness. And he's constantly probing and trying to see where the weakness lies so he can improvise you know, some action. Yes. When he comes up against strength and he's not able to expand into that space, then he changes and moves. I mean, is that more accurate way of how he behaves and how he tests the strength of his opponents?
Yes, that's what I actually got from my interviews with policymakers. I was told that Putin is not strategist; he is tactician in this in a way like punching behind his weight. So he's able like to wait and then to hit when his enemy is weaker. And I don't know if you saw this huge article in Washington Post about how US had intelligence and no one believed. And there is also a description of why Putin decided to start it in February 2020. So he was looking at this situation in US. He was looking that there is this UK left EU and there is this instability, the new chancellor in Germany. And so he analyzed all these different things and he just then he waited and then attacked.
That's right. And of course, waited until the Olympics had finished because he needs China to be an ally. And there's all these little calculations, aren't there? One of his recent actions, which I find difficult to understand, but maybe you have a view on it, that is why he's declared martial law across territories that he only partially controls. I mean, does this have any practical impact on the war, or has he got political reasons for declaring martial law?
Well, that's again, he does a lot of things outside of our logic, yes. But regarding martial law, it's again, it's control over the population. So population are not allowed to go out, are not allowed to move freely because it's martial law there. It's a way to scare the population, of course. And also it's kind of legitimization of what Russian soldiers did before. So now they're allowed to kill everyone who protests. Now they're allowed to take property, which they were doing before, but now it's already legally, you know?
That's it. And the other one, of course, is checking people's phones, because what they must have realized is that over the last 7 months,
they were doing this before as well.
Yeah, I mean, what's worked really well is open source intelligence. It's people reporting, using mobile phones, using communications infrastructure, being able to report where Russian ammunition dumps are, being able to say, oh, there's a column has just passed by and give the locations, and they must realize that to gain better control over the battlefield, they need to suppress these sort of communications that can be used by the civilian population to mount a kind of open source resistance.
Yes, this also.
Let's talk a little bit about the fake referendums, because again, this is an action which is difficult to explain, at least again using the framework of Western foreign policy logic, because these referendums are clearly bogus, they're faked, they're recognized as such by most governments around the world. So why does Russia do things that lack credibility, and to some people's eyes it's just ridiculous?
There is logic in this as well, so it's possible to understand. So Russia does not fully reject the international law. It plays with it. It searches for some gaps, and it just plays very wisely with it. And there was also research on how Russia used international law to justify its annexation of Crimea. So majority of people also say that everything is illegitimate. Yes, there is no point. But Russia was actually using international law. Russia was actually trying to prove it. And first of all, it's done for home, for Russians. Yes, to tell them, yes, these people wanted, there was referendum. Russia was inviting these observers from European far right or far left also. So Putin needed this place, this theater for audience at home, because then they believe in this more. Then it works also for some people in the West. For some ordinary people who watch Russian news, it also switches them more towards Russia, in particular, when there is a crisis in the West, they're dissatisfied with their politicians, and so it makes EU, for example, it makes EU weaker, and these people are switching to far right or far left for more pro-Russian, so it's also helpful for some ordinary people in the West. it's also helpful. Russia gains some political capital. I can just mention to you, just today I read there was this voting at UN General Assembly for resolution condemning this annexation of these four regions. And just one member of Ukrainian parliament wrote a note that they were trying, they were trying to convince one this representative from one African state, and they came to this person and were trying to convince him to vote for this resolution. And he asked if this resolution is in line with requirement of urgency. And then these Ukrainian MEPs, they noticed at once that that's Russian propaganda. Russia was promoting that this resolution is not urgent because the war is going on for 8 months already. So if it's not urgent, then it should not be voted, you know. And then they were trying to convince him that yes, it's urgent, but they just noticed that Russians already came to him and already promoted their understanding of this, of international law. So it helps in this way also for foreign countries for gaining this foreign capital.
And of course, it's worth mentioning that whereas the UK and the US will tend not to have any sympathy for those kind of legalistic games, there are many countries of the world which have not completely broken with Moscow, who are very, very ready to normalize relations, in particular in Africa, the Middle East. You have India, of course, as well, which has very strong military and economic ties to Russia. So I guess even though it seems meaningless and it seems like a bit of a sort of pantomime, the fact that they try to show some kind of adherence to international legal frameworks means that there are countries in the world who are very keen to resume normal trade ties and normalize relations just as soon as the war is over, and that gives them that ability to perhaps quickly do that.
Yes, of course, and some in EU also would like to resume relations and sanctions abiding for everyone. And you know, probably a few days ago, Hungarian Prime Minister also said that he would advocate against sanctions because he also, and he did not even use any justification, any legal justification, just for the benefit of economy.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I think we have certain views of Viktor Orban and where his loyalties lie in this conflict. And yeah, I mean, we'll get a lot of comments, I think, in the chat when we mention India, Hungary, Serbia. That tends to get a lot of people very, very annoyed. The one question I wanted to ask as well here is that Russia clearly has a problem with its borders. I mean, 2014 wasn't the first instance of that. We had 2 Chechen wars. They invaded Georgia. They have got involved in all sorts of territorial disputes over the last 20 years, and of course earlier. Does Russia really understand where its borders lie? Does it even have a concept of borders? Does it care about, you know, international borders as they've defined by law, or really does Russia play to a completely different rule book?
Well, there is this one idea of the Russian world, you know, Russian world and all Russian speakers. So then Russia may find Russian speakers in every country, and then to call Russian borders the whole planet, yes? So that's if we follow this logic. So it may be by Russian speakers, and still then looking at Baltic states, there are a number of Russian speakers, and that's why they're also scared about this. But regarding current referendums, yes, in the beginning was this confusion, and in the beginning you remember that Putin's press secretary Peskov could not answer these questions where Russian borders are. But then he checked with Putin probably, and then he said that the Donetsk Republic was recognized in borders of 2014, but part of its territory still needs to be liberated by Russia. And also he mentioned the territory with the military civilian administration at the time of acceptance to Russia. So concerning these new regions, So it also this territory is controlled by Russia then. But we see new attacks, new counteroffensive from Ukraine, and so some of parts of these regions already freed by Ukraine, and so they're not part of Russia again. So it's it's always very very confusing to understand, and yeah, now they just can. They easily can say that the whole region is part of Russia, and they try to fight for it. But as I say, it's all tactical, fast decisions. Yeah, they may play on this. And why in the beginning they organized these referendums? Because again, they were losing the territory, so they wanted just to take it as fast as possible and just to call it's Russia. It's now Russian territory, and now we can protect it.
And sort of fast forwarding a few months, as more territory is incrementally taken back and more towns liberated, more crimes, of course, will come to light as well. But what is going to be the most dangerous, the most humiliating thing for Putin? Is it when Ukraine liberates, Luhansk and Donetsk and takes that territory back, or is Crimea going to be the greatest humiliation? Because we saw his reaction to the attack on the Kerch bridge, and that seemed to be almost beyond a political reaction. That seemed to be quite sort of vindictive, the way that was carried out immediately against civilian targets. What is this tripping point for Putin where he will then be in extreme danger, in terms of the losses that he's inflicted?
Well, I don't think that there is some concrete point which we can see now, and it will stay for a few months, because Putin is changing his tactic, and but he needs to have some victory in Ukraine. He needs to save face, and he needs to get anything for his supporters in Russia, for his people around him, powerful people from military and security services who basically hold him in power. And for ordinary people, yes, they could change something. They could invent a new kind of propaganda and to convince them, but you cannot invent victory where there is totally no victory. Yes. So he needs to have something. He needs to have something more. When he started this operation in February 2022, he needs to show something more. And he cannot lose. He cannot lose, and because it will be the end of his power. It will be possibly the end of Russia. And yes, everything's becoming more dangerous, because he cannot lose it. And of course, even if if he loses Crimea, even if he loses Donbass or some of new gains from this year, it would be a humiliation for him. And already these attacks, Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which were confirmed by Ukrainian side, this attack on Kerch bridge, it was not still, Ukraine still did not take responsibility, although there were some discussions, and US intelligence said that US intelligence said that it would be that it was likely that it was Ukraine, but still Ukraine did not take responsibility, and there is this version that it was organized by Russians themselves due to the fight between military people and people from security services, because they're dissatisfied with these losses in the war. But yes, it shows that Russia cannot control its territory.
That's right, and there's been quite a bit of focus of partisan actions in Belarus, but there's also been a lot of actions in Russia itself, haven't there? Warehouses burning down, vojenkomat being torched, or that's more like to be local.
The last shooting closer to Ukraine.
Mass shootings, yeah.
Yes,
but even much more coordinated strategic accidents, research institutions associated with the military and advanced weaponry. A massive warehouse burnt down of one of the main suppliers of textbooks, especially history textbooks. And we know how much the perversion of history and teaching has played in this role, and the whole Z propaganda in schools. And so there have been some very strategic acts of sabotage, maybe not nearly enough, but I'm sure we won't know until after the war to what extent, Ukraine's government was involved, and whether there are actually collaborations with elements of, as you say, the Russian security services. It's at the moment it's difficult to know, isn't it? The facts behind many of these things.
Well, this is still not enough, all this protest in Russia, and this also only started now due to mobilization, because the Russians were not satisfied with this. And as we see, Putin's support rating, it rose from 60% to 80% when the war started. And then it fell a bit in September to 70, I think, percent, because people were dissatisfied with this mobilization. So it was a response not to the war. They were not against the war. They were not against this mobilization. But it's still not enough. It just whether Ukrainian security services cooperate with Russian ones on this, I don't know. And I mean, in Ukraine there is this mood that there should not be any talk with any Russian, and I don't know whether they could do this. It's during the war it's hard to say such secret, to discuss such, because it's all secret, obviously.
That's right, and it's interesting to make a comparison, isn't it, with Britain in World War II. I mean, there were extreme restrictions placed on the media in World War II. Trade union activity, dissent or protest of any sort was ruthlessly suppressed in Britain, as well as stories that might damage morale. I think stories that could help to improve military efficiency and so on were sort of allowed, but within certain limited or coded language. But anything that really threatened the morale of the people was also suppressed. Stories about disasters or losses were certainly underplayed a lot. How does that control of wartime media in Britain perhaps compare to what we see in Ukraine at the moment?
During the war, it's very easy opportunity to concentrate power and become a dictator, because you always have justification for this. And we could see some elements already in 2014 and later when Poroshenko was in power. We could see how he was already closing some channels and also calling his opponents pro-Russian. So now it's very easy. If you don't like some critique or anything, if you don't like someone, you can just call pro-Russian, and interestingly, even before this invasion, already Zelensky, during Zelensky rule, some YouTube channels were deemed pro-Russian and were closed. Some TV channels. And during the war, there is this one news, so only one channel, a few channels united, and they have this coordinated one news. And interestingly, I mean, there was this attack on pro-Russian parties, which were naturally pro-Russian, like Medvedchuk, but also in spring this year, channels of previous President Petro Poroshenko were also excluded from broadcasting. And he could not be named pro-Russian, but his channels were also excluded. And there are still some YouTube channels, but sometimes people get into trouble even with this. So it's very strict, and this one use, that's not something that you would see in a democracy. And sometimes it's self-censorship. So I know even by my friends who are in different industries, and they still think that, okay, first we fight with our external enemy and then we turn to our internal. Now we need to be united. We cannot criticize the power. We cannot give we cannot help Russia in any way, you know. But then yeah, there are certain mistakes which you can reveal to help Ukraine to win. And if you do not help, if you have this opportunity, professionalism to help, and you do not do this, it may the war may last longer. And there are some people who, some analysts, some soldiers who started revealing these mistakes of leadership, corruption, and they have problems with the government. Some court proceedings are opened against them. The great example is General Krivonos, who is a very famous general in Ukraine, and he was a few times in the military. And when the war started, he was protecting Zhulani airport in Kiev. And so he protected this airport, and because of this, Russians were not able to land near Kiev, because if they landed, it was like a few kilometers and towards Zelensky and all Ukrainian government. And he got this from chief commander. He got this request to protect the airport, but it was not, I think, there was no signature or something. Like it was during the war, you know, and it was like only by phone. And now they opened the court proceeding against him that he protected this airport illegally. And he's the only very quite famous and professional person who is speaking against. I mean, I would not say against, because he's always offering what could be done better, and he's a professional in this. He's for many years in the army, and he fought during in 2014 during the previous and during current invasion, and he always gives some pieces of advice, and he already has a problem. So some regular people who are just criticize the government and they're not very famous, they also face even harder prosecution.
It's difficult, isn't it? We also know that Russian propaganda is vicious, and it will use any kind of splits to work its sort of toxic power. But I wonder if, again, the experience of Britain points towards one option, that let's assume Ukraine wins and recovers its territory. People will have sacrificed so much, you know, whether they've actually fought or lost family members or possessions or houses. People will have a sense that the future has to be better than the past. They'll have a sense that fairness, economic fairness and political fairness will need to be observed, because they've sacrificed so much for the country. Doesn't that suggest that, you know, there's going to be a lot of political pressure, a lot of political change, a lot of, and if, as you say, politics is behind society, is not moving as quickly as society is evolving, then there may well be quite a lot of pressures in future that build up, and dare I say, even friction between people and their government and institutions.
Well, hopefully, I do hope for this, because Ukrainian civil society really developed, and now, like before 2014, I could say there was no civil society in Ukraine, like everybody was for themselves, but now everybody is taking responsibility for their country. Now every Ukrainian abroad or in Ukraine, in every profession, small or yeah, there were like children 8 years old were singing and getting money for Ukrainian army, and so everybody's taking this responsibility and thinks that we are doing not enough for our land. So everybody, yeah, it's a real civil society now. But regarding corruption, whether people will be ready to fight and what can be changed, you know, in Ukraine there was always this corruption, and there was no democratic institutions were built to control this, and also there were already three revolutions, and every time there was a change of faces, but still the same people, the same oligarchs controlling everything, and they were still also younger, older, or from different parties, people, they were still doing the same. There was still corruption. So there is this kind of fatigue already. So we did the revolution, but there was no change and dissatisfaction. Now, of course, yes, maybe the war would be some kind of inspiration, hopefully. And also it's important, for the West to understand that Ukrainians are not fighting for Zelensky, for oligarchs, for other politicians. They're fighting for democracy, for human rights, for their values, for their country. So hopefully then when this external enemy will be defeated, then internal ones will be also defeated, and Ukrainians will be able to build the full democracy with respect to human rights. But also Ukrainian politicians now, they may understand that when the war ends, it may be dangerous for them.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting point you made earlier about sort of purging pro-Russian parties, but then also using that to maybe purge some of your opponents as well, which is obviously, you know, not ideal at all. But isn't it also true to say that vast amounts of money were pumped into Ukraine by Moscow as it tried to buy off local politicians, influencers, key people within, say, the military and administration? I think Putin actually believed that he had bought enough people off to be able to take over the country relatively quickly when he invaded in February. So there must be, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of people within the government administration who technically, if you could uncover these associations with Russian money, are sort of assets or agents. How difficult was it to identify them and you know, purge them? And let's link that as well to Kherson, because Kherson fell very quickly, didn't it? Partly because, I think you might have suggested this, partly because of that sort of Russian influence and control, which it managed to bribe its way in over the years.
Well, there are already certain allegations that there are still Russian agents within high officials in Ukraine now, but that's all very, very hard to prove. And of course, there is certain influence on Ukraine from the West and also from Russia, and it was visible in 2014. There were a lot of Russian agents, and some of them it's easy to reveal them, but others are not so easy. And it's interesting. Yes, also talking about this, how effective was Ukrainian government. The same thing as in Kherson, it happened also in northern regions, in Sumy Chernihiv region where I come from. And there was also no preparation. And a few days before the invasion, security services, police, everyone from the government, they just escaped. And then Ukrainians, ordinary people, had to take a weapon and organize into this territorial self-defense units, and they had to protect it. Regarding Kherson, there are these allegations that there was the mining of Changar Peninsula, and also there was a possibility to blow bridges to Crimea, and this was not done. That's General Krivanos also talks about this. And there were apparently also some Russian agents within security service, and there is already court proceeding opened against them. But will only some ordinary people, low-level officials be prosecuted and high-level not? Or will also some high-level politicians get into prison for this? Or there was also investigation regarding Ilovaisk battle and Debaltsevo in 2014-15 against high military commanders, but still no one was brought to justice. So it's very hard. We don't have democratic and working institutions and courts in Ukraine.
Well, my last question, because I know we're sort of coming to the end shortly, but the last question really is about your activity as a social activist. If you could describe the kind of things you're involved in and what you've been doing over the years, and potentially how have your activities changed during the war? Because you mentioned that so many people across Ukrainian society are now involved in doing things, civic activities, you know, whether it's helping medically, driving ambulances, or cooking food for the troops, or just looking after people in the local communities. Everyone I've spoken to seems to be doing, you know, half a dozen things each when in various levels of civic involvement. But what about you and your activities?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a member of Professional Government of Ukraine. It's an organization of alumni of the world's best universities who want to build the best government in the world in Ukraine. I'm for 4 years a member, and for 2 years I'm elected member of the board. And it's harder to organize our activities because everybody is doing so many things, but still we are able to continue with our projects. And yeah, just remembered something from the past which I would like to share, and it's also related to how we can influence and why is it important to share your expertise. So just 1 year ago, last autumn, one of our members asked Zelensky at the conference. Yes, he asked the question that we are organization of the best of graduates from the best universities, and we are here in Ukraine. We want to help, and we sent you a letter. He didn't respond, and Zelensky invited him to bring 10 people, and so they can think how we can help. And then, as I was also last year a member of the board, we have 12 members of the board. So we discussed this idea, and we made this call for people. And so we have 3,000 members in Ukraine. And the active ones are maybe a few hundred, but we made this call and people applied with their projects, what they offer, how they, which expertise they have, and in which areas they can help Ukraine to develop. And we chose these 10 members, and they met with Zelensky administration, and they discussed these ideas a few times, and they were Zelensky administration was fascinated, of course, clever people after Cambridge and with their expertise. But in the end, only one person became Ukraine's ambassador in one country, and others were offered just worse positions than they had before. And so this ended, and there was no further contact. And currently, we make some political statements. For example, we condemned this ban for students to leave Ukraine because we understand how important is education. But still, we see that there is no request, no interest in our help, although we have this experience and expertise. And this is very sad because we have a lot of professional, clever people in Ukraine who want to do something, and now it's a critical time for Ukraine it's a very critical time, and Ukraine should use all of its potential.
And of course, thousands and thousands of people are now involved in, as you say, various international organizations. They're either studying or they're involved in various sort of groups. It's going to be important, isn't it, for those people to be able to contribute to the further evolution of governance and civic society. And of course, the judiciary, I mean, crucially, one of the areas that had I think, the lowest success rate in improving was the judicial system within the country. So there's still a lot to improve, isn't there, even after the war ends?
Yes, of course. And regarding judiciary, we have this National Anti-Corruption Bureau. I just saw today that they opened some new investigations against 2 deputy ministers and 1 advisor to Zelensky. And there are accusations of stealing of humanitarian help, which is a big issue in Ukraine now. And it's already not the first not the first finding of NABU regarding this disappearance of humanitarian help, but whether this will reach the court. Yeah, in Ukraine, it's also so that we know our problems. We see who is corrupted, but it's sometimes people, even with experience and motivations, don't have these tools to change it.
Well, I think that's probably we'll have to end it. I think that's a relatively positive note to look forward to the future and to look forward to further evolution of society. I really hope, of course, that your work goes well. I hope that Ukraine emerges triumphant as soon as possible in the war, and Russia starts dealing with its own internal problems, which are currently expressed in this sort of external aggression, which so many countries have experienced. Thank you so much, Alina, for your time and for sharing your insights. And Slava Ukraini.
Heroям Slava. Thank you so much. And I would like to wish Ukrainians to stay brave, to fight for future, and not to be afraid to express our minds openly. And I hope our fight will continue, and Ukrainians will get our deserved place under the sun.